It was the summer of 1933, and Maurice Wilson sat alone in the cockpit of his battered biplane, the Everest. Beneath him stretched the endless, churning waves of the Persian Gulf. His fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. The air was thick with heat, and every mile brought him closer to disaster. He had only learned to fly 2 months earlier, and his rudimentary skills were no match for the conditions he faced. But turning back was not an option. Maurice Wilson wasn't just flying to India. He was on a mission to conquer the unconquerable, to crash his plane into the slopes of Mount Everest. Look, the audacity of Wilson's mission didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was the product of a life shaped by war, rejection, and restless ambition. Born in 1898 in Bradford, England, Maurice Wilson grew up in a modest middle-class family. His father was a textile mill owner, and Wilson seemed destined for a life of predictable stability. But destiny, as it often does, had other plans. The outbreak of World War I pulled Wilson from the familiar confines of Bradford and thrust him into the chaos of the Western Front. At just 18 years old, he joined the British Army, where his bravery and determination set him apart. Rising through the ranks to second lieutenant, he earned the Military Cross for his actions during a brutal battle in Flanders, holding his position against an overwhelming German assault. In 2015, he wrote the first heroics of World War I, the Battle of Brunswick, which was fought on a market street in the middle of Flanders. But while Wilson's courage saved lives, it came at a cost. He was wounded in action, with injuries to his back and arm that left him in chronic pain for the rest of his life. Worse still was the psychological toll of war, a gnawing sense of displacement, and a lingering bitterness toward bureaucracy that would follow him into adulthood. By the time the war ended, Wilson, like so many of his generation, was left searching for meaning. What does a man do when the chaos of war subsides, leaving only the deafening silence of peace? For Wilson, the answer was movement. Over the next decade, he wandered the world, leaving behind a trail of business ventures, failed relationships, and restless ambition. In New Zealand, he built a thriving fashion business with his second wife, Ruby Russell, but soon abandoned it. In North America, he roamed aimlessly, moving from city to city without purpose. By the early 1930s, his travels had brought him back to London, but the years of wandering had taken their toll. He was gaunt, coughing incessantly, and sinking into a deep depression. By all accounts, Maurice Wilson was a man adrift, untethered from anything resembling stability. And then, as he later claimed, something extraordinary happened. Wilson encountered a mysterious mystic in London who introduced him to a life-changing idea. Fasting and prayer could cure illness and unlock untapped potential. Wilson, desperate for a way out of his despair, embraced this method wholeheartedly. Over weeks of self-imposed isolation, he fasted, prayed, and emerged feeling rejuvenated. For Wilson, this wasn't just a personal transformation. It was divine proof. He became a man on a mission, determined to show the world the miraculous power of faith. But how does one demonstrate faith on a scale so grand that it captures the attention of the world? Wilson found his answer in a newspaper article. The piece chronicled the ill-fated 1924 British expedition to Mount Everest, during which climbers George Mallory and Andrew Irvine disappeared near the summit. Everest, the tallest mountain on Earth, represented humanity's ultimate challenge. The experiment for Wilson, it became the ultimate stage to prove his beliefs. He resolved to climb to the summit of Everest alone, armed with nothing but his faith, fasting, and an unshakable belief in divine assistance. The scale of Wilson's ambition was matched only by his lack of preparation. He had no experience in mountaineering and little understanding of the mountain's dangers. His training regimen consisted of walking through the English countryside and purchasing basic equipment, including a tent, woolen clothing, and a single oxygen canister. He dismissed technical mountaineering tools like crampons and ice axes as unnecessary burdens, and then there was his plan to reach the mountain itself. Eschewing the logistics-heavy expeditions of the past, Wilson decided he would fly himself to Everest in a small biplane, land partway up the mountain, and climb the rest of the way. It was a ludicrous plan by any standard, but Wilson pursued it with dogged determination. He purchased a second-hand de Havilland Gypsy Moth biplane, painted its name Everest on the side, and began flying lessons. His instructor, alarmed by Wilson's reckless handling of the controls, warned him he'd never make it to India. Wilson simply replied, "I'll reach India or die trying." Contrarian stated. In May 1933, despite repeated warnings from the British government, Wilson took off. His journey across Europe and North Africa was a comedy of errors and near disasters. He crash-landed near Bradford, was detained by police in Cairo, and refueled with contaminated fuel in Tunisia, narrowly avoiding engine failure. Each mishap seemed to fuel his resolve. When he reached British India, his story had already become a sensation, with newspapers following his every move. But in India, Wilson's journey hit a wall. The British authorities, increasingly frustrated by his defiance, impounded his plane, effectively ending his plans to fly over Nepal to Everest. Grounded but undeterred, Wilson sold the Everest and devised a new plan. With the help of 3 experienced Bhutia porters, he crossed into Tibet, disguised as a Buddhist monk. However, it was there, a threat that soon got to him. Together, they trekked through the rugged Himalayan terrain, evading suspicion and braving the elements, until they reached the Rongbuk Monastery at the base of Everest. Everest was the home of the Rauk Nanfon Hutka. It was here, under the shadow of the world's tallest peak, that Wilson began his ascent. His first attempt was an exercise in futility. Exhausted and snowblind, he abandoned most of his gear and staggered back to the monastery. But Wilson was nothing if not persistent. After weeks of recovery, he set out again, this time accompanied by 2 of his porters. They made better progress, reaching Camp 3 on the icy slopes of the mountain. But the harsh weather and Wilson's deteriorating health forced another retreat. On May 29, 1934, Wilson set out alone for a final attempt. His diary entry that day was simple and optimistic. "This will be a last effort, and I feel successful." It was the last anyone saw of him alive. 2 months later, his body was discovered at the foot of the North Col, surrounded by the remnants of his camp. He had died just a few thousand feet short of the summit. His final diary entry, dated May 31, read, "Off again, gorgeous day." Maurice Wilson's story is one of relentless ambition and the limits of human endurance. His journey was as much about proving something to himself as it was about proving something to the world. Though he failed to reach the summit, his determination and faith captured the imagination of those who followed. As one climber later said, "It was not mountaineering, yet it was magnificent."